The German weapon. The MP40 submachine gun trembled in Jake McNeese's hands as he crouched behind the bombed farmhouse near Carentan, the weapon's unfamiliar weight a constant reminder of how wrong the night drop had gone. June dawn broke grey through the Norman fog, carrying the desperate calls of pinned American paratroopers somewhere beyond the hedgerow and the methodical advance of German boots on wet stone. 3 hours earlier, McNeese had found the weapon beside its former owner, a young German paratrooper whose face looked no older than the farm boys from Oklahoma he'd grown up with. The irony wasn't lost on him, using German engineering to execute American audacity. But his Thompson lay somewhere in the flooded pasture where his C-47 had scattered the filthy 13 across 3 miles of enemy territory, along with most of his demolition charges and any hope of completing their original mission. The bridge at Pont du Phare was supposed to be rubble by now. Simple demolition work, the kind McNeese could execute blindfolded after 2 years of blowing things apart across Europe. Instead, he'd spent 6 hours moving through the bocage like a ghost, collecting scattered equipment and searching for his men. What he found instead was Easy Company's 2nd platoon, 12 paratroopers trapped in a drainage ditch by 2 German machine gun nests. Sergeant Bill Talbot had been bleeding from shrapnel wounds, trying to coordinate a breakout since midnight. His face was pale with exhaustion and pain when McNeese found him. "We're cut off," Talbot whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant chatter of machine guns. "Radio's dead, reinforcements coming from the east. Been trying to work around those gun positions all night." McNeese studied the MP40's mechanism, checking the magazine. 32 rounds, enough for what he had in mind if his timing was perfect and his luck held. The German weapon felt balanced in his hands, its brutal efficiency obvious even to someone trained on American arms. He'd seen enough of these weapons to understand their capabilities: high rate of fire, reliable mechanism, devastating at close range. The trapped paratroopers lay pinned in the drainage ditch, their ammunition running low with each passing hour. German reinforcements would arrive soon, turning a desperate situation into a massacre. McNeese had always been willing to bet everything on one decisive action when hesitation meant watching good men die. The men called it his fearless push. Not reckless exactly, but a terrifying clarity that came when split-second decisions separated heroes from casualties. During his reconnaissance, he'd spotted the drainage culvert running beneath the enemy positions. It would bring him within 20 yards of the first machine gun nest, close enough for the captured weapon to matter. The plan crystallized in his mind with the cold precision that had carried him through Normandy's hedgerows and countless impossible situations. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The drainage culvert was barely wide enough for McNeese's shoulders, filled with 2 feet of stagnant water that soaked through his jumpsuit and chilled him to the bone. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space: the distant chatter of machine guns, the desperate shouts of wounded men, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears as he moved through the Norman countryside's hidden arteries. He'd left Talbot with instructions to wait for his signal, then create covering fire for the breakout. The sergeant had looked at him with something between admiration and disbelief. "That's either the bravest thing I've ever seen planned," Talbot had said, "or the craziest." "Sometimes there ain't much difference," McNeese had replied, checking the MP40 one final time before disappearing into the culvert. Now moving through the fetid water with the German weapon cradled against his chest, McNeese felt the familiar combination of terror and determination that always preceded his most desperate gambles. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him. 12 American lives depending on his ability to turn enemy equipment into an instrument of survival. The bocage around Carentan had become a maze of stone walls, thick hedgerows, and flooded fields where paratroopers from the 101st Airborne had been scattered like leaves in a storm. The carefully planned drops had dissolved into chaos, leaving small groups of men to improvise their way toward objectives that seemed impossibly distant. McNeice had learned to navigate this confusion through 2 years of combat, but tonight felt different, more desperate, more personal. Lieutenant Morrison from Easy Company had briefed them on holding the Pont du Phare bridge, delaying German armor pushing toward the beachhead. Standard objectives, clear demolition work. But the C-47 had taken flak over the drop zone, and now Morrison was missing along with half the original mission parameters. What remained was the immediate reality of trapped paratroopers and the methodical advance of an enemy patrol moving to finish them. The first German machine gun position materialized through the fog, exactly where McNeice had calculated. 2 soldiers manning an MG42, their attention focused on the trapped Americans in the drainage ditch 50 yards away. They wore the same grey-green uniforms he'd seen across Europe, young faces marked by exhaustion and the constant tension of frontline duty. McNeice emerged from the culvert behind them like a muddy apparition, the MP40 steady in his hands. The weapon spoke in sharp, controlled bursts, its German-engineered precision turning against its creators with devastating efficiency. The soldiers never saw him coming, never heard the whisper of his boots on wet earth. The second machine gun nest was 50 yards away, across open ground that offered no cover except speed and the element of surprise that wouldn't last much longer. McNeice sprinted through the hedgerow gap, the MP40 chattering in his hands as he drew German fire away from the trapped paratroopers and onto himself. Bullets whined past his head, chewed up the Norman earth at his feet. But the fearless push had its own momentum now. He rolled behind a stone wall, flanked left through a bombed barn, and emerged from the Germans' blind spot with 15 rounds remaining in the magazine. The engagement lasted 90 seconds from start to finish. When the shooting stopped, 2 machine gun nests had been neutralized, and 12 American paratroopers were moving through the hedgerows toward friendly lines. McNeice sat in the mud beside the second German position, the empty MP40 across his knees, his hands shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion that came after every desperate gamble. The weapon felt heavier now, weighted with the knowledge of what it had accomplished. He'd taken the enemy's own engineering and turned it into an instrument of American survival, but the irony brought no satisfaction, only the hollow feeling that always followed combat, when the immediate danger passed and left him alone with what he'd done. News from other sectors filtered through the Normandy bocage like whispered rumors. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment had taken heavy casualties during the scattered drops, with entire companies missing or cut off from their objectives. Radio communications remained spotty, leaving small unit leaders like McNeice to make critical decisions based on incomplete information and pure instinct. Sergeant Talbot found him 20 minutes later, studying the German weapon with something between respect and revulsion. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," Talbot said, settling beside him in the mud, "or the craziest thing." McNeice looked up, his face streaked with mud and cordite residue. "Sometimes there ain't much difference between the two." The rescued paratroopers gathered around them, their faces mixing gratitude with awe. They'd watched him emerge from the culvert like some muddy apparition, had seen him charge across open ground under machine gun fire. Private Collins, barely 19, and still shaking from 6 hours pinned in the ditch, stared at the MP40. "How'd you know it would work? Using their own weapon against them?" McNeice shrugged, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Didn't know. Just knew we couldn't stay pinned down waiting for help that might not come." He stood slowly, every muscle in his body aching from the sprint through enemy fire. The German submachine gun remained in his hands, a tangible reminder of decisions made in desperate moments. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rescued paratroopers moved through the Norman hedgerows with renewed purpose, but McNeice carried the MP40 like a burden he couldn't set down. The weapon had saved 12 American lives, yet holding it felt like carrying a piece of the enemy's war inside his own hands. Every step through the bocage reminded him of the German paratroopers who'd once carried this same weapon. Young men who'd probably been just as scared and determined as his own squad. Captain Andrews found them at a crossroads near a bombed church, his face grim with news from the scattered drop zones around Carentan. "Half the regiment still missing," he told McNeice, studying the German weapon with professional interest. "Division wants every man who can fight to push toward the causeway. Jerry's bringing up armor." The bridge at Pont du Phare remained standing, its stone arches intact, despite the mission that should have brought it down hours ago. McNeice felt the weight of that failure alongside the weight of the MP40. Two burdens that somehow balanced each other in his mind. He'd saved 12 men with a captured weapon, but the original objective, denying the bridge to German armor, remained incomplete. "What about demolitions?" McNeice asked, thinking of the scattered TNT satchels and detonation cord lost during the chaotic night drop. "Any word on where the engineers landed?" Andrews shook his head. "Supply situation's a mess. Most of the demolition gear came down in the wrong fields. What we've got left needs to be saved for priority targets." He paused, studying McNeice's muddy face. "I heard what you did back there, using their own weapon to break up those gun positions. The action felt larger in the telling than it had in the living." McNeice remembered mostly the cold water of the culvert, the unfamiliar weight of the German weapon, and the terrible clarity that came when 12 lives depended on his willingness to gamble everything on one desperate push. The heroic aspects that others saw were abstractions to him. What mattered was the faces of the men who'd walked away alive. Private Collins approached with careful steps, his young face still marked by the terror of being pinned under machine gun fire. "Sergeant McNeice, what's it feel like, using their weapon like that?" McNeice looked down at the MP40, its metal surfaces scarred from combat and rough handling. "Feels like doing whatever it takes to get everyone home," he said quietly. "Weapon doesn't care who pulls the trigger, long as the cause is right." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. American paratroopers depending on German engineering for survival in the Norman countryside. But war had its own logic, requiring adaptations that peacetime thinking couldn't comprehend. The MP40 had become an instrument of American determination, its origin less important than its effectiveness in the hands of someone willing to use it. Years later, when military historians asked McNeice about his actions near Carentan, he would remember details that never appeared in the official reports. The weight of the German weapon in trembling hands, the face of the young paratrooper who'd once carried it, looking no older than boys from Oklahoma farms, the sound of his own breathing in the drainage culvert, amplified by fear and determination in equal measure. What the citation didn't mention was the moment of pure panic when the MP40 nearly jammed during the first engagement, McNeice frantically working the bolt while German bullets chewed up the stone wall beside him. Or the sick feeling in his stomach as he realized the weapon's previous owner was probably someone's son, carrying letters from home and photographs of people who would never know how their boy's rifle had saved American lives. The fearless push that others admired was, from the inside, mostly controlled terror and stubborn refusal to watch good men die when action might save them. McNeice had learned to function through that terror, to make decisions when hesitation meant casualties, but the cost accumulated in memories that wouldn't fade with time. Sergeant Talbot, binding his shrapnel wounds with strips torn from a German uniform, watched McNeice clean the captured weapon with methodical precision. "You all right, McNasty? You've been staring at that thing for 10 minutes. McNeice looked up, his hands still moving automatically through the cleaning routine. "Just thinking about the guy who carried it before me. Probably wasn't much different from us. Scared, cold, trying to get his buddies home alive." He worked the bolt, checking the mechanism's smooth operation. Makes you wonder what stories he might have told, if things had gone different. The moral complexity of using enemy equipment against its creators wasn't something they'd covered in demolition training. McNeice understood the practical necessity. American weapons were scattered across 3 miles of Norman countryside, while this German submachine gun had been right there when 12 paratroopers needed immediate help. But understanding necessity didn't eliminate the strange weight of carrying an enemy's tool of war. Private Collins, still shaky from his time in the drainage ditch, sat down beside them. "My dad fought in the last war," he said quietly. "Used to tell me about taking German helmets, souvenirs and such, but using their weapons to fight them, that's different somehow." McNeice nodded, his fingers tracing the MP40's worn surfaces. "War makes you do things you never figured on. Question isn't whether it feels right. Question is whether it saves lives, when saving lives is what matters most." He looked at the 12 rescued paratroopers, now moving with purpose through the bocage toward friendly lines. Sometimes the enemy's own weapon becomes the tool that gets our boys home. The MP40 became a story long before McNeice was ready to tell it. Word spread through the scattered units of the 101st Airborne, the demolition NCO from the Filthy 13, who'd used a captured German weapon to save 12 trapped paratroopers near Carrington. Each retelling added details that hadn't existed in the original action, polishing the rough edges until the desperate reality became something closer to legend. McNeice kept the weapon through the rest of the Normandy campaign, though he never fired it again. It rode in his pack alongside his recovered Thompson, a tangible reminder of what war required when conventional solutions failed. Sometimes he'd catch other paratroopers looking at it with curiosity or unease, wondering what it meant to carry the enemy's weapon as a tool of American survival. The bridge at Pont du Faz finally came down 3 days later, demolished by engineers with proper charges and official authorization. McNeice watched the stone arches collapse into the Norman River, thinking about missions that succeeded and missions that transformed into something entirely different. The bridge's destruction was tactical success. The rescued paratroopers were human victory measured in faces rather than tonnage. Decades later, sitting in his Oklahoma home with grandchildren who couldn't imagine the weight of making life-or-death decisions in European hedgerows, McNeice would sometimes take out the old photographs from Normandy. The official ones showed confident paratroopers with clean weapons and determined expressions. The unofficial ones, taken by someone's pocket camera, captured muddy faces and exhausted eyes that told different stories. He never kept the MP40 after the war ended. It went into a collection pile with thousands of other captured weapons destined for scrapping or museums where visitors could examine German engineering without understanding the moral complexity of using enemy tools for survival. McNeice was content to let it disappear. The weapon had served its purpose, and that purpose lived in the memories of 12 men who went home to families they might never have seen again. The sound of it echoing through Norman hedgerows stayed with him longer than the weight of it in his hands. Sometimes a backfiring truck or the stutter of machinery would bring back the MP40's distinctive chatter, followed immediately by memories of cold water in drainage culverts and the faces of young German soldiers who'd looked remarkably like American farm boys. War's ironies accumulated that way, in sensory memories that connected enemies across the arbitrary lines of nationality and uniform color. McNeice understood that the legend simplified what had actually happened, reducing a complex moment of moral improvisation to a clean story about American ingenuity and German equipment. The truth was messier: fear and determination, necessity and doubt, the strange intimacy of using a dead enemy's weapon to save living friends. But legends served their own purpose, inspiring others to find solutions when conventional approaches failed. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel. tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.